A prisoner returns from isolation to find himself a legend, his quiet strength transforming a violent prison into an unexpected haven of peace. But when his greatest test arises, will his discipline be enough to face it? The steel doors slid open with a deafening clang, and Leon stepped into the dimly lit corridor of Ironhold Penitentiary, a prison infamous for housing the most dangerous criminals in the region. He felt the weight of the place immediately, a heavy, oppressive atmosphere that seemed to cling to his skin. Rows of cells loomed above him, each filled with shadows and hostile stares. The cacophony of muffled shouts, clanging metal, and faint laughter echoed ominously around him. But Leon kept his head down, his movements deliberate and unassuming. Leon was an enigma in this environment, barely above average height, with a lean frame and unremarkable features. He could have easily been mistaken for someone who didn't belong here. His quiet demeanor only made him stand out more among the towering, broad-shouldered figures who prowled the prison grounds. Still, there was a sharpness to his gaze, a subtle intensity that hinted at the man beneath the fragile exterior. He had once been a master of martial arts, a title earned through years of discipline and pain. But that life was behind him now, and he carried no desire to reignite it here. The prison guard escorting him, a burly man with a permanent scowl etched into his face, handed Leon his assigned bedding and muttered, "Cell 42, Block D. Welcome to Ironhold, rookie." Leon offered a brief nod, choosing silence over engagement. He had learned long ago that words were often unnecessary, and in a place like this, they could be dangerous. As he made his way through the cell block, he felt the eyes of the other inmates on him. Some gazes were fleeting, mere glances of curiosity, while others lingered with overt malice or amusement. Whispers rippled through the crowd like an electric current, their words barely audible but unmistakably mocking. "Look at this one," a gruff voice said from a corner. "Bet he won't last a week." Another voice, higher pitched and mocking, followed. "He's so small. What's he gonna do, talk us to death?" Leon ignored them, his expression a mask of calm indifference. He had faced worse than taunts before, and he had no intention of feeding the fire. He had a plan: stay under the radar, avoid unnecessary conflict, and survive until his time here was done. Yet he knew that plans were rarely so simple in a place like this. Arriving at his cell, Leon found it as grim as expected. The walls were bare, marked by scratches and graffiti from previous occupants. The narrow cot against the wall looked barely functional, and the small window above it allowed just enough light to remind him of the world outside. He set his bedding down methodically, taking a deep breath to steady himself. But as he began to settle in, he felt the weight of someone's gaze. Glancing up, he caught sight of a towering figure leaning casually against the bars of a nearby cell. The man's expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp and calculating. "You don't look like you belong here," the man said, his voice low but firm. Leon held his gaze for a moment, then turned away, refusing to engage. He could feel the tension in the air, but he knew better than to give it life. For now, his survival depended on one thing: staying invisible. The air inside the prison was heavy with tension, an unspoken language of dominance and survival filling every corner. Leon had been here for only a short time, but the rules of this place had already begun to etch themselves into his mind. Watch but don't stare, speak but not too much, be invisible but never look weak. It was during a quiet moment in the yard that Leon first noticed Ramon. The older man sat alone on a cracked concrete bench, his shoulders hunched forward as though carrying the weight of the world. The other prisoners moved around him like he wasn't there, or worse, like he was. Bruises peeked out from under his threadbare shirt, a silent testament to his vulnerability in this brutal hierarchy. Leon hesitated. Reaching out to someone like Ramon was a risk, but something about the man's frailty stirred a sense of responsibility in him. Perhaps it was because Ramon reminded him of someone, an uncle, a neighbor, or maybe just the quiet, overlooked men from his old life. "Hey," Leon said, his voice low, careful not to draw too much attention. He sat down beside Ramon, keeping a respectful distance. Ramon glanced up, startled, his bloodshot eyes scanning Leon's face. For a moment, he looked like a deer caught in headlights, unsure if this was the prelude to more torment. "I'm Leon," he offered. "You okay?" Ramon didn't answer immediately. His gaze shifted around the yard, checking for unseen threats. Finally, he murmured, "You don't want to be seen with me, kid." It'll only make things worse. Before Leon could respond, a shadow fell over them. He looked up to see Carlos, the leader of one of the most notorious prison gangs. Carlos was built like a bulldozer, his muscular frame covered in crude tattoos that marked him as a man of power in this unforgiving place. "Isn't this sweet?" Carlos sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. His gang lingered a few steps behind him, their laughter low and menacing. "The new guy playing hero." Leon stood, his heart pounding, but he forced himself to hold Carlos's gaze. He'd learned early in life that showing fear only fed bullies, but this was different. Carlos wasn't just a bully, he was a predator. "Leave him alone," Leon said, his voice steady but quiet. Carlos chuckled, the sound cold and humorless. "Leave him alone?" He stepped closer, his presence suffocating. "You think you're in a position to give orders, rookie?" Leon didn't flinch, though every instinct screamed at him to back down. The yard seemed to grow quieter, other prisoners subtly watching the scene unfold. Ramon shifted uneasily on the bench, his face pale with fear. Carlos leaned in, his breath hot and rancid. "You don't know how things work here yet, but you will. Keep your nose out of other people's business, or you'll find out the hard way." With that, Carlos straightened, his smirk a promise of trouble to come. He motioned for his gang to follow, and they melted back into the crowd like wolves returning to the shadows. Leon sat back down, his hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline began to fade. Ramon muttered a shaky, "Thank you," but Leon barely heard it. His mind was already racing, calculating the cost of his actions. For better or worse, he had been noticed. The sun hung low over the academy courtyard, its golden rays casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. Leon adjusted the strap of his worn leather satchel, his eyes scanning the scene before him with measured calm. A group of 5 figures blocked his path, led by Carlos, whose confident smirk contrasted sharply with the tense stares of his followers. "Leon," Carlos began, his voice dripping with mock authority. "It's time you learn where you stand around here. This is our space. You're either with us or against us." Leon's gaze met Carlos's without a flicker of emotion. Behind him, Ramon fidgeted nervously, his hands clutching the straps of his backpack. "I'm not looking for trouble, Carlos," Leon replied evenly. "We can all get along if we respect each other." Carlos chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Respect?" he repeated, stepping closer. "Respect is earned, and you, my friend, haven't earned anything yet." The tension was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Carlos's group began closing the circle around Leon and Ramon, their movements slow and deliberate. Ramon glanced at Leon, fear etched into his features, but Leon remained still, his breathing steady. "Come on, Leon," Carlos pressed, his voice now sharper. "Show us that you know your place. Kneel. Apologize for being in our way." Leon didn't move. His stillness was unnerving, a sharp contrast to the restless energy of the group around him. "I'm not kneeling," he said simply, his voice calm but firm. The smirk vanished from Carlos's face, replaced by a flicker of irritation. One of his followers, a wiry boy with a scar running across his cheek, stepped forward. "Let's teach him a lesson," he hissed, his fists clenching. Before Leon could respond, the boy lunged, not at Leon but at Ramon. The move was sudden, a flash of aggression aimed at the weaker target. Ramon barely had time to raise his hands in defense before the first blow was aimed at him. Instinct took over. Leon stepped forward, his hand shooting out to intercept the attacker's wrist mid-swing. The force of Leon's grip stopped the punch cold, and for a brief moment, the courtyard fell silent. "You don't want to do this," Leon said quietly, his eyes locked on the boys. His tone wasn't threatening. It was matter-of-fact, almost gentle, but it carried an undeniable weight. The boy hesitated, his bravado faltering. But Carlos wasn't about to let this challenge to his authority slide. "Don't just stand there," he barked. "Get him!" The group surged forward, but Leon moved like a shadow, his actions precise and efficient. A sidestep here, a deflection there, each motion calculated to neutralize without escalating. In seconds, 2 of Carlos's followers were on the ground, groaning, while the others hesitated, realizing they were outmatched. Carlos stared at Leon, his jaw tight. "This isn't over," he growled, retreating as he pulled his followers with him. Leon watched them go, his stance relaxed but his eyes sharp. Ramon stumbled to his feet, his voice trembling. "Leon, how did you—" Leon placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Let's go," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for questions. As they walked away, the sun dipped further below the horizon, its light fading into the coming night. The air in the cell block was charged with an unusual tension. News of Leon's confrontation with Carlos had spread like wildfire through the prison's winding corridors. In the shadowy corners of the yard, where whispers carried farther than shouts, inmates huddled together, recounting what they had seen, or, more often, embellishing what they had heard. "Did you see the way he stood his ground?" one murmured, eyes darting nervously to ensure no guards overheard. Carlos didn't expect that. No one did. Leon had become an enigma overnight. To some, he was a symbol of quiet defiance, a man who had dared to challenge the unspoken hierarchy of the prison. To others, he was a fool who had painted a target on his back. Either way, he was no longer invisible. Carlos, on the other hand, seethed with rage. His pride had been wounded, a dangerous thing for someone like him. The self-proclaimed kingpin of the cell block, Carlos had ruled through intimidation and brute force, his authority unquestioned until now. The idea that a newcomer, a nobody, had stood up to him was intolerable. In his cell, Carlos plotted his revenge. "He thinks he can make a fool of me?" he hissed to his closest lackeys, his fingers tightening into fists. "I'll show him what happens to anyone who crosses me." His men, a loyal band of hardened criminals, nodded grimly. They knew better than to question Carlos when he was in this state. Plans for retaliation were already forming, whispered in low tones as they waited for the right moment to strike. Meanwhile, Leon sat on the edge of his cot, deep in thought. The adrenaline from the confrontation had long since faded, leaving behind a gnawing sense of unease. He had acted on instinct, defending himself in a situation that had offered no alternative. But now he was facing the consequences. The glances he received from other inmates were different now. Sharper, more curious. Some seemed impressed, others wary. And then there were those whose stares carried a darker intent, eyes calculating as they assessed him. Leon knew these looks well. He had seen them before, in a past life he was trying to leave behind. He clenched his jaw, feeling the weight of his situation. He had never wanted attention. His goal had been survival, plain and simple. But now, survival had become far more complicated. Carlos would not let this slide, and Leon would have to be ready. He tried to map out his next steps, his mind racing with possibilities. Should he find allies? Should he strike first, or wait for Carlos to make his move? Every option carried risks, and in a place like this, trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. The distant clanging of a metal gate snapped him out of his thoughts. The guards were making their rounds, their heavy boots echoing through the corridor. Leon leaned back against the cold wall of his cell, trying to steady his breathing. He wasn't afraid. Fear wasn't a luxury he could afford here either. But he couldn't deny the growing tension that coiled in his chest. The prison was no longer just a cage, it was a battlefield, and he had unwittingly declared himself a player in the game. The dim light of the prison corridors cast long shadows on the cracked walls, a reminder of the despair and tension that clung to every corner. Leon leaned against the wall of his cell, his gaze steady and unyielding. His reputation as a solitary but formidable figure had spread quickly. He had demonstrated his ability to fend off threats with a precision that left even the most hardened prisoners wary of crossing him. This aura of strength attracted attention, and not all of it hostile. Over the past few days, several inmates had approached Leon cautiously, testing his boundaries. Some sought protection, while others seemed to be weighing the possibility of using him as leverage for their own survival. Leon was no stranger to manipulation. His time inside these walls had taught him that trust was a rare currency, one that could easily cost a life if misplaced. One evening, Ramon, a wiry man with sharp eyes and a surprisingly calm demeanor, sidled up to Leon during the brief moments they were allowed in the yard. "You've made an impression," Ramon said, his voice low and measured. "But strength alone won't keep you safe here." Leon's eyes narrowed slightly. He had seen Ramon in passing, usually lingering on the edges of the yard, always observing. There was something calculated about him, but he didn't radiate the malice Leon had come to associate with most of the other inmates. "And what are you suggesting?" Leon asked, his tone neutral. Ramon glanced around before stepping closer, lowering his voice even further. "You're strong, but even you can't fight everyone. These gangs, they don't just come for you. They go after anyone who looks like an easy target. If we stick together, we can protect each other. Strength in numbers, you know." Leon remained silent, his mind churning. He didn't trust easily, but Ramon's logic was sound. The gangs ruled the prison with brutal efficiency, and standing alone made him a target. He weighed the risks, studying Ramon's face for any hint of deceit. Ramon seemed to sense his hesitation. "Look, I'm not saying we trust everyone," he added quickly. "We keep it small, just a handful of people we can rely on. Enough to watch each other's backs, but not so many that we draw attention." The idea was tempting, though Leon wasn't ready to commit just yet. "Why me?" he asked, his voice edged with suspicion. "Why not someone else?" Ramon shrugged. "Because you've got what it takes to lead. People respect you or fear you. Either way, they'll listen. And me? I'm good at spotting people we can count on. Think about it." Leon watched as Ramon walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. As the murmurs of the prison yard swirled around him, Leon's mind lingered on the possibility. It was a gamble, no doubt. But in a place where survival was a daily battle, perhaps it was one worth taking. Later that night, as Leon lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling, he made his decision. The walls of the prison were closing in, and alliances, however precarious, might be the only way to push back. The courtyard was alive with murmurs. Sunlight streaked through the cracked stone walls, casting long shadows that seemed to dance with the tension in the air. Carlos stood in the center, his posture rigid, his voice echoing with confidence that bordered on arrogance. "Leon!" Carlos called, his sharp tones slicing through the noise. "Face me like a man, or will you cower behind your allies forever?" Leon emerged from the shade of an old archway, his boots tapping against the cobblestones, his dark eyes fixed on Carlos, scanning for any signs of deceit. He knew Carlos's bravado wasn't just a show of strength, it was a trap. One false move, one moment of hesitation, and Ramon, along with anyone else under Leon's protection, could pay the price. "Enough of this, Carlos," Leon said firmly, his voice calm but loud enough to carry over the gathering crowd. "You don't have to do this." Carlos smirked, spreading his arms as if inviting the entire courtyard to witness his challenge. "Oh, but I do. The people need to see who truly has the upper hand. A man like you," he gestured dismissively at Leon, "hides behind words and empty promises. Prove your worth if you dare." Leon exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes on him. To refuse would mean exposing his vulnerability, giving Carlos the leverage to further torment Ramon and the others. But to accept meant walking into a confrontation he wasn't certain he could win. "I don't want to fight you," Leon said, his tone carrying a hint of warning. "This isn't strength, it's desperation." Carlos's smirk vanished, replaced by a sneer. "You talk too much." He drew his blade, the steel glinting menacingly under the sun. "Now either take up arms or kneel before me. Those are your choices." The murmurs grew louder. Some bystanders whispered prayers, others exchanged nervous glances. A small group huddled together near the edge of the courtyard, Ramon among them, his face pale with worry. Leon's gaze briefly met Ramon's. He could see the fear in the boy's eyes, the silent plea for protection. That was all the answer Leon needed. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on his shoulders. "If I accept," Leon began, his voice steady despite the tension, "it's under one condition. If I win, you and your men leave Ramon and the others alone. No more threats, no more harm. Swear it." Carlos barked a laugh, his confidence unshaken. "And if I win?" Leon's jaw tightened. "Then do what you will with me, but you'll leave them out of it." The crowd fell silent, holding their breath as Carlos considered the terms. Finally, he nodded. "Agreed. But don't think mercy will save you." Leon's hand moved to the hilt of his sword. The blade felt heavier than usual, as though it too understood the stakes of the fight ahead. The courtyard seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with anticipation. Around them, the spectators formed a loose circle, creating a makeshift arena. "Let's end this," Carlos growled. Leon took his stance, his eyes locked on his opponent. Whatever happened next would not only determine his fate, but also the safety of those he had sworn to protect. The dusty courtyard of the prison was unusually silent, an oppressive tension hanging in the air. Dozens of inmates stood in a wide circle, their faces etched with curiosity, fear, and the faintest hints of anticipation. It wasn't every day that a showdown occurred between prisoners, let alone one involving Leon and Carlos. Leon stepped forward, his movements precise and measured, his gaze fixed firmly on Carlos. The taller man sneered, cracking his knuckles loudly, his confidence evident in the swagger of his stance. Carlos was the self-proclaimed king of the courtyard, a man who ruled through intimidation and brute strength. Leon, however, was different, an enigma to most, with a calm demeanor and an unshakable presence that unnerved even the most hardened inmates. "You sure about this, Leon?" Carlos taunted, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You don't look like much. Maybe I'll go easy on you." Leon said nothing, his expression unreadable. He simply adjusted his footing, a subtle shift that signaled he was ready. The crowd hushed further, the only sound the faint whisper of wind brushing through the dry prison grounds. Carlos lunged first, his attack reckless and fueled by overconfidence. His fist shot forward with the force of a battering ram, aiming for Leon's jaw, but Leon moved like water, fluid, seamless. He sidestepped the blow with minimal effort, his hand darting out to redirect Carlos's momentum. Carlos stumbled forward, unbalanced, his face flashing with surprise. The crowd erupted in murmurs. Leon's counter was swift and precise. A sharp twist of Carlos's wrist sent the larger man's arm behind his back in a painful lock. Carlos growled, trying to twist free, but Leon's grip was unyielding. Instead of pressing the advantage to injure, Leon released him and stepped back, his stance still calm and ready. "Try again," Leon said quietly, his voice carrying a calm authority that cut through the murmurs. Carlos roared, his embarrassment fueling his aggression. He charged at Leon with a flurry of wild punches, each one faster and more desperate than the last. Leon dodged with an almost unnerving ease, his movements economical and precise. A swift pivot brought Leon behind Carlos, and before anyone could register the sequence, Carlos was disarmed and on his knees. Leon's arm locked across his opponent's chest, his other hand pressing lightly against Carlos's neck. It wasn't a chokehold, nor was it designed to hurt. It was a demonstration of absolute control. The courtyard fell silent again, the sheer skill of Leon's maneuver leaving everyone stunned. Even Carlos froze, his earlier arrogance evaporating in the face of his humiliation. "You've lost," Leon murmured, releasing Carlos and stepping away. His voice wasn't mocking. It was factual, firm, and final. Carlos knelt there for a moment, his fists clenching and unclenching. Slowly, he rose to his feet, his gaze burning with humiliation. But he didn't attack again. Without a word, he turned and walked away, the crowd parting to let him pass. Leon exhaled quietly, relaxing his stance. His eyes scanned the crowd briefly, meeting the stares of the onlookers. Then, without fanfare, he walked away, leaving the prisoners to their whispers and awe. The courtyard was no longer Carlos's domain. The cell block buzzed with tension. Word of Carlos's defeat at Leon's hands had spread like wildfire, igniting equal parts admiration and resentment. To some, Leon had become a symbol of defiance, a force that challenged the unspoken hierarchy of the prison. To others, particularly the guards and rival gang leaders, he was a dangerous anomaly that needed to be extinguished. Leon sat alone on the cot in his cramped cell, the cold concrete walls pressing in on him. His knuckles were still raw, a silent testament to the fight that had unfolded just days earlier. Despite his victory, a foreboding sense of unease had settled over him. He could feel the eyes on him, sharp, calculating, and waiting for him to falter. It didn't take long for retaliation to come. That morning, during the chaos of breakfast in the mess hall, a pair of guards cornered Leon near the serving line. Their faces betrayed no emotion as they twisted his arms behind his back and marched him out, ignoring the muttered protests and jeers from the surrounding inmates. "Disrupting the peace!" one of them muttered coldly as they hauled him through the corridors. Leon didn't resist. He knew better. Resistance only made the punishment worse. The guards threw him into an isolation cell, slamming the heavy steel door shut behind him. The clang echoed ominously, sealing Leon away from the chaotic world outside. The room was barely larger than a closet with nothing but a hard bench and a flickering overhead light. The air was thick and stale, carrying the faint metallic tang of blood and sweat. Isolation was the guard's favorite tool, meant to break even the toughest inmates. Leon leaned his back against the wall, letting his head fall against the cool concrete. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, trying to focus his thoughts. Days in isolation blurred together. There was no way to tell time except for the sporadic arrival of meals, shoved unceremoniously through a slot in the door. Leon's mind raced with fragmented memories of the fight with Carlos, of the roaring crowd, and of the eerie silence that followed his victory. Meanwhile, back in the general population, Carlos was far from defeated. Humiliated but not broken, he had begun gathering his remaining loyalists. They huddled in the shadows of the yard, plotting their next move. Carlos's pride had been wounded, and he knew that his grip on power was slipping. The prison was an ecosystem, and any sign of weakness was an invitation for predators to strike. "He thinks he's won," Carlos snarled, his voice a venomous whisper. "But he doesn't know the first thing about survival in here." His followers nodded, their faces grim with determination. The fragile equilibrium of the prison had been shattered, and Carlos was determined to restore it by any means necessary. Back in his cell, Leon could feel the storm brewing, even through the thick walls that confined him. He didn't need to see the yard to know that Carlos wasn't done. The fight had shifted from fist to strategy, and Leon would have to decide whether to endure or strike first when he was finally released. For now, though, all he could do was wait. The cell was a tight, unyielding space, yet within its suffocating walls, Leon found something he never expected: silence. It wasn't the absence of sound. There were always the distant murmurs of other inmates, the clanging of keys, the shuffle of footsteps. But inside his mind, the chaos that once roared with rage and violence was beginning to still. Seated on the edge of his cot, Leon stared at the scuffed concrete floor. His hands, calloused and scarred, rested on his knees. They had been tools of destruction, weapons honed by a life of survival and dominance. He had always believed that power lay in strength and fear, that respect was earned with blood. But here, behind bars, stripped of his illusions, Leon began to question everything he once stood for. His thoughts drifted to his younger self, an angry boy with nothing to lose, raised in streets where mercy was a weakness. He had fought for everything, for safety, for dignity, for a place in a world that had cast him aside. That fight had defined him, it had hardened him, but now, in the stillness of confinement, it felt hollow. The prison was a crucible, melting him down to his core. Leon couldn't ignore the faces of the men around him, hardened by years of struggle, each carrying stories of pain and loss. Many were victims of the same cycles that had shaped him. Yet within these men, Leon saw flashes of something unexpected: vulnerability. It wasn't always obvious, but in moments of quiet, when the bravado faded, it was there. A man humming a tune from his childhood, another clutching a letter from a distant family member. The fragile humanity they tried so hard to hide. For weeks, Leon withdrew. He spoke less, observed more. His reputation as a fierce fighter had insulated him from threats, but it also isolated him. He began to realize that respect, earned through fear, was fleeting. True respect, the kind that could endure, required something deeper. One night, after the lights had dimmed, Leon overheard a commotion in the far corner of the block. A younger inmate, barely 20, was being cornered by a group. Leon recognized the desperation in the boy's voice, the helplessness of someone who didn't belong in this brutal world. Instinctively, Leon acted. Rising from his cot, he approached the group. "Enough," he said, his voice low but commanding. The men hesitated, weighing the risks of defying Leon. One by one, they backed away, muttering curses under their breath. The boy looked up, his face a mix of relief and fear. "You all right?" Leon asked, his tone softer now. The boy nodded quickly, avoiding his gaze. Without another word, Leon returned to his cell. That moment stayed with him. He had used his strength not to dominate, but to protect. For the first time, it felt right. In the days that followed, Leon noticed something shifting. The boy he had helped now followed him at a distance, a silent shadow of gratitude. Others too began to watch him differently, not with fear but with a cautious respect. Leon sat on his cot, the pieces falling into place. He could use his influence, his reputation, to build something better. Here in this grim place, he could be more than a predator. He could be a protector, a guide, a force for something greater than himself. The thought filled him with an unfamiliar sensation: hope. The gates to the main prison yard creaked open, and Leon stepped through. The faint scrape of his boots against the concrete was the only sound as the yard's usual chatter died down. Every eye was on him, but there was no malice, no hostility. Instead, the gazes carried a mixture of curiosity, respect, and a touch of awe. Leon's time in isolation had changed more than just him. It had shifted something fundamental in the air of the prison itself. Leon walked with a steady, calm stride, his shoulders relaxed yet purposeful. The tension in the yard, usually palpable and charged, felt lighter. He wasn't the same man who had fought tooth and nail for survival just weeks ago. The bruises on his face had faded, but the scars on his knuckles remained, a quiet reminder of battles fought and lessons learned. Yet it wasn't his physical presence that silenced the crowd. It was the quiet strength in his eyes. Carlos, once the shadow that loomed over Leon's every step, was nowhere to be seen. Rumors whispered through the blocks about how Leon's transformation had left Carlos exposed, vulnerable, and eventually stripped of his allies. Without the gang wars to fuel his power, Carlos had been left to fend for himself. A transfer notice came swiftly, an unceremonious end to his reign. Leon hadn't sought revenge, though. That was what confused and intrigued the other prisoners most. By all rights, he could have used his newfound respect to retaliate, to reclaim what had been taken from him in blood and humiliation. Instead, he chose silence. It was his discipline, his restraint, that turned heads and stirred whispers. "Yo, Leon," a voice broke the quiet. A younger inmate stepped forward hesitantly, his tattoos betraying his allegiance to one of the prison's gangs. "Word is, you don't roll with anyone no more. That true?" Leon paused, his gaze meeting the man's. He nodded, his expression calm but firm. "That's right, no colors, no sides." The response spread like wildfire. No one went without alliances in here, not without paying the price. And yet Leon stood there, untouchable, respected even by the rival factions. He had carved out a space beyond the invisible lines that divided the yard, a space no one dared to cross. What followed in the days and weeks after his return was nothing short of extraordinary. Fights that once erupted daily seemed to dwindle, replaced by quiet standoffs that dissipated with a single look from Leon. His mere presence acted as a deterrent, a reminder that chaos wasn't the only way to survive. Where others used violence to assert dominance, Leon used something far more powerful: composure. Leon's influence wasn't overt. It wasn't barked orders or shows of force. It was in the small moments, the way he helped an older inmate carry his tray in the cafeteria without expecting anything in return, the way he broke up a scuffle without throwing a single punch, or the way he listened when someone needed to talk. He never sought followers, but they came anyway, drawn by his quiet strength. "Man's a legend," one inmate muttered as Leon walked past. "Not a legend," another corrected. "A leader." The prison guards noticed the change too. "You see Block D lately?" one officer whispered to another. "It's like night and day. Whatever Leon's doing, it's working." Leon didn't dwell on the whispers or the stares. He kept his head down and his actions deliberate. For him, this wasn't about power. It was about control. He'd learned in isolation that true power came not from dominating others, but from mastering himself. Carlos's departure became a distant memory, his name rarely spoken. In his absence, Leon's reputation grew, though it wasn't just about him anymore. The changes he inspired rippled outward, fostering an atmosphere of cautious peace. Gang leaders, once relentless in their pursuits, found themselves questioning their next moves. The cost of violence seemed higher in Leon's shadow dot at night. Leon would sit by his bunk, the echoes of the yard quiet now, and reflect. He didn't see himself as a savior or a leader. He was just a man who had survived, who had chosen a different path when the opportunity arose. But to the others, he was proof of something greater, that even in a place designed to break men, strength could come from within. The legends about Leon would only grow, whispered from cell to cell, passed to new arrivals like folklore. He was no longer just another inmate. He was a symbol, a reminder that in the darkest places, discipline and control could shine brighter than brute force. And in that, Leon found peace. The story of Leon teaches us that true power isn't found in dominance over others, but in mastering yourself. In a world designed to break him, Leon chose a different path, one of peace, discipline, and quiet strength. What would you have done in his place? Would you have sought revenge, or would you have had the courage to rise above and inspire change? Click on the video on your screen to continue this journey of self-discovery and learn more about what it takes to lead with resilience. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories and insights. See you in the next chapter.